The Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy, is fighting for his political life after his fellow Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz filed a rarely used motion to try and oust him. Mr. Gaetz and other hard-right conservatives in the Republican Party have clashed with Mr. McCarthy after he passed a bill with the help of Democrats to fund government agencies and avoid a government shutdown.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 2A1 of Rule 9, I rise to give notice of my intent to raise a question of the privileges of the House. Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 2A1 of Rule 9, I rise to give notice of my intent to raise a question of the privileges of the House. Declaring the office of Speaker of the House of Representatives to be vacant. Resolved that the office of Speaker of the House of Representatives is hereby declared to be vacant.
A number of Democrats right now are saying the same thing, that they don't trust him.
The one thing we have in common is he's lied to all of us.
A handshake deal right now. If you were to move forward, if there were to be any kind of agreement, what would that look like, and what would you need to see from the Speaker at this moment?
I think the die is cast based on the motion I just filed. I think the time for that discussion would have been over the last several weeks, but instead we saw the Speaker continuing the Speaker did not just fail to remediate the breach of the agreement he made with us in January, he accelerated the instances of breach. Like, after I laid out the breach, he went and violated the 72-hour rule. After I laid out the breach, he violated the $100 million no amendment suspension rule. So he seems to be reverting to the very unfortunate muscle memory of Washington, D.C. that has put our nation atop a $33 trillion debt that has led to $2 trillion annual deficits in our near future.
Well, for more on this, let's bring in Arise U.S. correspondent Eric Ham, who joins me live from Washington. Good to see you, Eric. So the Republican Speaker of the U.S. House, Kevin McCarthy, facing a direct threat to his leadership. Tell us more.
Yeah, that's right. And it looks as though now, as he was fighting for the speakership, like we saw earlier this year when it took 15 tries to get him over the finish line, now he is fighting to hold on to his speakership. And we're getting so much information about what this vote might entail, Charles. In fact, we just heard that House Democrats are not going to vote present, which means that would not count towards his ouster, and that they are not going to do anything to save him, meaning that they will actually take a vote. They met for about an hour earlier today, and by all indications, based on what we are told, is that there are no members of the House Democratic Caucus that are going to step in to try to save Kevin McCarthy. Now, that's in line with our reporting that we have been hearing from the Speaker himself, in that he has not reached out to Democrats to try to get on board to save his speakership. In addition to that, we know of at least 5 House Republicans who are prepared to vote to remove the Speaker from his position. Still, it is going to be a very, very tight vote in terms of how this goes down. But it looks as though this is going to be Kevin McCarthy's possible last stand. Now, all of this comes as we know there are about 42 days left until Congress has to have a final resolution for a budget heading into next year. If that doesn't happen, then what we could see is a potential government shutdown. But also to the backdrop of all of that, we know that because there was no Ukrainian funding in this short-term spending bill, President Biden today, we're told from our sources at the White House, is now actively calling at least 10 world leaders around the world right now to try to assuage and assure them that the United States is still on board and is still very much in support of Ukraine and will continue to back Ukraine with additional funds from the United States.
Briefly, Eric, because we want to move on to other things. You talked about Kevin McCarthy and the precariousness of his situation. I mean, how thin is the ice that he's standing on? Is it likely to come crashing down? And how has he been responding to this challenge to his leadership? I mean, what's he been saying briefly?
Well, he spoke earlier today and he said, look, all it takes is 5 Republicans to side with all of the Democrats and I'm out. And right now, there are 5 Republicans who have who have vocally stated publicly that they will not support him as speaker. Now, based on what we are hearing, and I'll just give you some more inside information that we got earlier today. There is this one caucus called the House Problem Solvers Caucus. It's made up of both Republicans and Democrats. Democrats came to the Republican members of that particular caucus and said, we will not save the speaker, which means that it looks as though all Democrats are on board and not supporting Kevin McCarthy as a speaker. One of the biggest reasons they have for this is because of his about face on January 6th, where he, in the immediate aftermath, demeaned President Trump for his actions, but then immediately flew to Mar-a-Lago to stand in support with him. Democrats have now said that they are done with Kevin McCarthy's double dealing and are ready to move on from him.
On from Kevin McCarthy, because another Republican drama has been playing out in New York, where Donald Trump has been in court at the start of his fraud trial, though it's a civil case, not a criminal trial. What's the latest on that, briefly?
Yeah, we heard from the former president once again this morning, lashing out at the New York Attorney General, lashing out at the judge, and then lashing out at the system, saying that I don't have a jury trial. This is all left to a judge to make this decision. But the clear point of this is his lawyer actually opted out of a jury trial. And now we already see where this stands. And the question now, Charles, is not if Donald Trump is going to be found liable fraud, because that has already been ruled. The question now is how much is he going to have to pay? Will it be the baseline of $250 million, or will it be considerably more?
And briefly again, Eric, let's turn to President Biden's son, Hunter, who's been appearing at a Delaware courthouse on charges of illegally owning a handgun. I understand he's entered a not guilty plea. Just remind us what that is all about.
Yeah, this comes down to a failed plea agreement that Hunter Biden entered into with the federal government over this case. This is an issue that has been adjudicated for more than 5 years now. Because of the breakdown of that plea deal, Hunter Biden had to reappear in a Delaware courtroom this morning. The entire process lasted no more than 30 minutes. He had to fly back for this. He entered a not guilty plea, and now it's back to the beginning, where they were either trying to strike a plea agreement or they will go to trial in this case.
Eric, thank you very much, and thank you for being brief. Eric Ham is Arise U.S. correspondent. He was talking to me there from Washington. Armenia has adopted the Statute of the International Criminal Court. Armenia's parliament ratified the Rome Statute earlier today. That brings the country under the jurisdiction of the court in The Hague. Joining the ICC means Armenia will be obliged to arrest Russian President Vladimir Putin if he sets foot there, because the court has issued an arrest warrant for alleged war crimes in Ukraine. The Kremlin says it's not the sort of decision that it expects from a partner. Ties have been strained between the two countries since Azerbaijan took control of the Karabakh region. Meanwhile, a UN team that's visited Nagorno-Karabakh has said as few as 50 ethnic Armenians could be left inside the enclave, which came under full Azerbaijani control last month. The UN said it had not received reports of violence, though its observers had only been allowed access to the regional capital Stepanakert and the Lankan corridor. Despite assurances from Azerbaijan that ethnic Armenians would be integrated as equal citizens, more than 100,000 of them have fled the region to Armenia.
In parts of the city visited by the team, they saw no damage to civilian public infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and housing, or cultural or religious infrastructure. However, no shops seemed to be open. The mission also saw that the government of Azerbaijan was preparing for the resumption of health services and some basic utilities in the city. The team also heard from representatives of communities that between 50 and 1,000 ethnic Armenians remain currently in Karabakh. Our colleagues were struck by the sudden manner in which the local population fled their homes and the suffering that experience must have caused them. They did not come across any reports either from the local population or from others of violence against civilians following the latest ceasefire. No destruction of agricultural infrastructure or dead animals was seen by members of the UN team. The team stressed the need to rebuild trust and confidence, adding that this will require time and efforts on all sides.
UN spokesman there. Well, let's take you to India now, where police have raided the homes of several journalists at more than 30 locations in and around New Delhi. The journalists are associated with the news website NewsClick. A case has been filed against the outlet under an anti-terror law. It comes after the New York Times alleged in August that NewsClick received funding from a businessman with links to China and promoted pro-Beijing talking points. The journalists say police have confiscated their laptops and their phones. India ranks right near the bottom of the World Press Freedom Index, which is compiled by Reporters Without Borders. Well, for more on this, let's bring in Arise Special correspondent Carl Bostic, who is monitoring developments from London. Good to see you, Carl. So, Indian police in Delhi raiding the homes of several prominent journalists and authors in connection with an investigation into the funding of the news website NewsClick. Tell us more about the raid and the allegation that the website is receiving illegal funds from China.
That's right, Charles. You really are talking about two different troubling trends going on right here, because this raid in many ways was not isolated. In other words, it was perhaps the most extensive of its kind on media interests in the past few years. As you mentioned, at least 30 separate locations were raided this morning, all coordinated, Charles, happening around 6 o'clock, 6:30 local time, of this on-site news channel called NewsClick. And they also provide video content on social media. They have a YouTube channel. They've actually been raided before, Charles, back in 2021, basically because they're very progressive. They're critical of the Modi government. But the difference is this time, Charles, because of that investigation by the New York Times in August, for the first time, India NewsClick was an agency that was being singled out amongst outlets that were, perhaps potentially promoting pro-Chinese propaganda or disinformation. This is also important, Charles, because India and China have a very, very strained relationship because of border disputes, most recently 2020, where 20 Indian soldiers were killed. That's the backdrop, Charles. But you need to keep this also in mind. These draconian anti-terror laws, the publisher, for example, 15 armed soldiers or police showed up at his residence this morning without a warrant, without papers, and took his mobile phone, took his computers, and this was played out across New Delhi, but also Mumbai as well. And the laws are so draconian, Charles, they can be held without bail, not charged, and be detained even for years, is what's happening. This has already happened since 2014, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party was elected. It's a pro-Hindu nationalist party, and they are very, very thin-skinned when it comes to any criticism of its pro-Hindu nationalist policies, especially against the Muslim minority. And that's why, for example, even outlets like the BBC, the officers were raided in February over 3 days on charges of tax evasion. They're using as the reason for this raid, Charles, the fact that perhaps they were receiving money or being funded externally by foreign businessmen, in this case, in line with China. And the businessman happened to be an American tech millionaire, Charles, who's actually based in Shanghai. At the same time, he's part of a campaign that also supports similar disinformation groups, not only in India, but places like Brazil, and yes, Charles, also Africa, for example, especially South Africa.
Right, and very briefly, Carl, we've got less than a minute. I mean, critics say the operation is an attack on press freedom and an attempt to control dissent in India. Is it?
Well, yes, Charles. I mean, since 2014, they talk about a steady erosion of press freedoms. You mentioned that index called the Press Freedom Index, run by Reporters Without Frontiers. India is now ranked 161 out of 180 countries. And that all changed since 2014, where you have no tolerance of any criticism of the government. And they use reasons of tax evasions or being, in this case, funded by foreign financing. In this particular case, China. And as I mentioned before, this is now being played out in South Africa with political parties there, where social activists are being recruited ostensibly to organize labor groups, but instead being given various lines of Chinese disinformation.
Carl, thanks very much indeed. Carl Bostic is a RISE special correspondent. He was talking to me there from London.